Good afternoon, and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference on Working for a Toxics-Free Future, International Efforts to Protect the Arctic from the World's Most Dangerous Chemicals. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information at akaction.org and at healthandenvironment.org. We are joined today by Marianne Lloyd-Smith, Senior Advisor to the National Toxics Network and to the International POPs Elimination Network, and Pamela Miller, Executive Director of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. Both of our speakers will be referring to slide presentations. Everyone who signed up for the call should have received a link to the presentations. You can also go to our homepage, as I mentioned, akaction.org, and click on the title of today's call. The call will last 1 hour with time at the end for your questions. CHE Alaska is holding this call about international actions to eliminate persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, because of the risks POPs pose to Arctic environments and communities. Persistent organic pollutants travel long distances on air and ocean currents, bioaccumulate, persist in the environment, and have toxic impacts on fish, wildlife, and people. The International POPs Elimination Network, or IPEN, of which ACAT is a member, has been working to have certain chemicals added for global elimination. These include pentachlorophenol, or PCP, used as a wood preservative, decabromodiphenyl ether, a flame retardant used in plastics and electronics, and difocal, a pesticide that uses DDT in its synthesis. All three of these chemicals are extremely harmful to human health and can be found in the breast milk and blood serum of people around the world, including indigenous peoples of the Arctic. Last month, at a meeting of the Stockholm Convention's POPs Review Committee in Rome, international experts made the important decision to advance all three of these chemicals towards a global ban. Our guest presenters attended the meeting and will discuss what happened and next steps for assuring global elimination of these chemicals. Now I'd like to welcome and introduce both of our speakers, Marianne Lloyd-Smith and Pamela Miller. Marianne Lloyd-Smith is Senior Advisor to the National Toxics Network and to the International POPs Elimination Network, or IPEN, which is a global network aiming to eliminate persistent toxic pollutants. Marianne gained her PhD from the Faculty of Law at the University of Technology in Sydney. Trained as a negotiator in chemical disputes, she has assisted residents with their negotiations over contaminated land and has participated in the international negotiating committees for the Stockholm, Rotterdam, and Basel conventions and the strategic approach to international chemical management. Dr. Lloyd-Smith co-authored the NTN report on the chemical impacts of unconventional gas, or UG, presenting the findings to governments, communities, and industry across Australia, UK, and Europe. She is chair of the International Working Group on UG Chemicals and was a member of the UN Expert Group on Climate Change and Chemicals. Pam Miller is Executive Director of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, a non-governmental environmental health and justice organization founded in 1997. In 2012, she was elected to the steering committee for the International POPs Elimination Network in recognition of her work on the Stockholm Convention. Pam is known for her work to prompt state, national, and international chemicals policy reform to protect environmental and human health in the Arctic. Welcome to both of you. And Marianne, would you like to go ahead and begin?
Thanks, Diana. Yes, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone, whatever time zone you're in. You've got my PowerPoints in front of you, so I will just try to name the slide I'm talking on. They're all numbered, so hopefully that will make it reasonably easy. So how I thought I would do this first is just tell you a little bit about the POPs Review Committee and how it functions and the processes, and then after that we'll go on to looking at what actually happened to POPRock 10. I'd also like to touch on some of the work that POPRock does with other scientific committees, such as AMAP in its work on climate. So if we go to slide number 2, which is the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, lovingly called Poisons Without Passports. Now, I'm sure most of you know this, so this is just a bit of a recap. To be a POPs, you have to be carbon-based, you have to be persistent, resist degradation, bioaccumulate in living things, be capable of transboundary movement, traveling on air and water currents, and of course be toxic to humans and the environment. When the convention was finally negotiated in 2001, it really encompassed what we used to call the dirty dozen. Unfortunately, now we have probably a dirty 50 or a dirty 200. But at the time, we focused on those dirty dozen. And there in the slide, under the photo of Shauna Larson, are the chemicals that were the first lot that were encompassed by the convention. I popped the photo of Shauna up there. I know many of you would know her and her work. But she holds the statue of the Inuit mother and child, which was presented to John Buccini, who was the chair of the Stockholm Intergovernmental Negotiation Committees. And it was there really to remind delegates of what was truly at stake when we were looking at the whole issue of POPs. So if we could move on to the next slide, which is number 3. The convention always was intended to be a living convention. So it would provide opportunities to add new chemicals or groups of chemicals with POPs characteristics. And this had to be done using a precautionary approach, which was, I think, a very, very important thing. Article 8 and Annex D, E and F are the rules to actually identify and list the additional POPs. And the body that was to do that was established in 2005, and it was called the POPs Review Committee. We now commonly call it the POPRock, and I'm often asked if I'm talking about a rock band or what, but anyway, so when I refer to POPRock, that's who I'm talking about. There's a set number of seats for the different regions. For example, Africa has 8 seats. WEOG, which is the European and the rest of the world, it has 7. And POPRock can go ahead and assess new POPs and recommend listings in either Annex A, B, or C. And you can have a listing, a recommendation to list a chemical in both Annex A and Annex C, for example, when it came to pentachlorobenzene. And that's because you're trying to get rid of not only the intentional production and use of the chemical, but you also want to reduce or eliminate its byproduct releases. And again, importantly, you don't need full scientific certainty. And when it comes to the conference of parties thinking about whether they should take the recommendation, they must do this in a precautionary manner. The photos there up top are the 2 chairs of POPRock. The first one is Dr. Rainer Arndt, who was the chair for the first 10 years. And I hope I will get a Stefania name right, but a Stefania Moreira from Brazil is our new chair. She took over this year and certainly did a magnificent job. On to the next slide. Before I talk too much about the process, I thought it would be just a good idea to remind ourselves just what has been achieved of 10 years of POPRock. And I would suggest an amazing amount. We really have seen the world rid itself of some of the worst chemicals. For Annex A, and that's the elimination annex, you can see a number of chemicals have been added to that. Penta-BDE, octa-BDE, both flame retardants, very toxic flame retardants. Pentachlorobenzene, a nasty old pesticide also used in dyes. Another flame retardant, hexabromobiphenyl. The pesticides, lindane and its byproducts, another pesticide, chlordicone, and of course the famous endosulfan, which was a major battle to get that one through. The hexabromociclododecane, or HBCDD, was also an interesting one because when I just mentioned about these specific exemptions, this is a good example of it. It went on to the Annex A elimination, but it was given a specific exemption for its use in expanded polystyrene and extruded polystyrene to allow companies in Europe to catch up and to change over and to get rid of that in their polystyrene manufacturing. And the important thing was it had this time-limited 5-year exemption, But while that exemption was on, companies had to make sure that the products made in that time were easily identified by labelling or other sorts of things through its life cycle. So you can have an exemption, but there are some costs to exemptions, and labelling is one of them. The two photos there, some of you will probably know Joe Dikeafate. He's pretty famous. And while I was preparing this, I found an old photo of Joe and I from POPRock 1. And as you can see, my hair was coloured and Joe actually had hair. And the photo down below is of POPRock 10. We've both aged 10 years. I'm sure it hasn't been our work in POPRock, but it has been an exciting and I think a very, very productive 10 years. Now back to the process. So we're now on slide number 5, the 3-stage assessment process. Probably what's important to remember is that only parties to the convention can actually nominate a chemical to be assessed, but everyone can participate in that assessment process. There are working groups set up throughout the process for each of the different stages, and they are open to all. And having experienced that for a decade, I would suggest that they are very open to the information that is provided by NGOs. So the process basically is step 1 is the POP screening criteria, which we find in Annex D of the convention. And that just basically ticks it off. It sort of says, well, yes, that shows some persistence, bioaccumulation, long-range transport, and adverse effects. That is, it has the criteria, it fulfills the criteria of POPs. If it gets through that, then it moves on to the risk profile stage. And I do stress it is a risk profile, not a standard risk assessment, because I'd suggest a standard risk assessment is very, very difficult to do, if not impossible, when you're looking at transgenerational impacts. And the risk profile requirements are set out in Annex C. And really, when you come to the end of the risk profile, you need to be able to say, well, this chemical is likely, as a result of long-range transport, to lead to significant adverse human health and or environmental effects such that global action is warranted. That is the conclusion that the risk profile must have before it can move on. And again, importantly, lack of full scientific certainty can't prevent the proposal from proceeding. If that is ticked off and that is the conclusion, then it moves on to the risk management evaluation stage, which really looks at all the socioeconomic considerations and looks at the costs of alternatives, whether there are alternatives, the impacts on society. It may look at some of the uses where there are no feasible alternatives. It'll consider phase-in time and propose, if appropriate, some exemptions. And each of these stages usually takes about a year. So by the time you've nominated your chemical and it goes through the next 2 stages, you know, most chemicals take 2, perhaps 3 years to get through the process. And a photo there is of the Inuit women reminding some of the delegates at one of the meetings what they were there for, and it certainly wasn't to promote their political interests. This is a scientific and technical committee. So next slide, please, which is number 6. While the POPRock makes the recommendation, the final decision as to whether a chemical is added to the convention is by the COP, by the Conference of the Parties, and that happens every 2 years. And the Conference of the Parties must agree by consensus. And as you see, there's a little quote there. That's their role, to take into account any scientific uncertainty and in a precautionary manner decide whether to list the chemical and to specify the control measures in Annex A, B or C. They must do it by consensus. POPRock does have the privilege in the lead up to this, if they come to an impasse, of actually taking a vote. And the photo there up the top there was the vote that was taken for endosulfan. And that was because it was really one country who opposed the listing. And although the POPRock hates doing a vote, it doesn't want to go that way. It wants to achieve things by consensus. In that case, it was impossible. A vote was taken and endosulfan moved on. But anyway, for the COP, they must do it by consensus, and then countries, the opt-out countries, automatically accept the new listings. The opt-in countries actually go back to Capital, discuss it, go through their regulatory process, and then if they decide to accept those new POPs, they must inform the Secretariat. What's also important is that the POPRock doesn't just do the chemicals. It also looks at other related issues. And so it's done a lot of work trying to understand the intricacies of various forms of bioaccumulation, interest work in debromination. There was a document done on mixtures and interactions. And very importantly, and something that I was involved in, was the work on climate change impacts and how that impacts on assessment of POPs. And there's also been some work on effective participation. The woman sitting in that bottom photo is a woman from Norway, Liselott, and really she has done some of the most powerful work and really pushed the work through on climate change. And that's what I'd just like to take a few minutes to discuss, because I think it is very, very important when it comes to POPs assessment. So we move on to slide number 7, which is POPRock's work with scientific bodies. And the document, and I do really recommend people take the time to read it. I think it has an awful lot of interesting stuff that is very relevant for chemical regulation. Climate change in POPs, predicting the impact. And it was a UNEP AMAP document, and it looked at the way climate change impacts on the release, distribution, exposure, degradation, and toxicity of POPs. And it really highlighted a number of those impacts. For example, higher temperatures increase primary releases. It changes the mobilization rate from products. It increases secondary mobilization from the sinks, which really reawakens many of the old POPs that we thought we had, dealt with. We're now seeing remobilized from things like permafrost and old waste sites and glaciers. There was a lot of evidence showing that there's increased partitioning from water to atmosphere and changes in degradation rates, and importantly, increased toxicity and decreased tolerance for heat. The next slide, which is just number 8, which is just a visual of the environmental fate of POPs, I won't go into it in detail, but you can see the relevance of POPs to the colder climates, not only in the Arctic but also in the Antarctic, and where these chemicals end up, where they have perhaps never ever been used. The next slide is number 9. I think it's important people think about the impact of climate change and POPs, or climate change in chemicals, in the environmental fate of chemicals, but forget about the impact on toxicity. And certainly climate change does impact on POPs toxicity and bioaccumulation. Factors like ocean temperatures and acidification and water oxygen all impact on an animal's ability to deal with the toxicity and also the way the POPs bioaccumulate in their bodies. I put a few examples there. That tragic photo is a photo of a Tasmanian devil, which live in one small area of Australia, in Tasmania, obviously, Tasmanian devil, and it now suffers, it will probably be extinct from a facial tumour disease, which is ravaging the population. And up until recently, they thought it was to do with the way they ate and bit each other, and it was a sort of a disease, a cancer that was spread like a disease. But more recently, there has been a link to chemicals, and when we saw the results of the devil's biopsies for some of the POPs chemicals like penta and octa-BDE, they had exceptionally high levels for animals in, national parks that literally have no exposure to these sorts of flame retardants. But it's not only for animals, it's certainly for humans. For example, climate change impacts on exposure in humans and the fact that we may spend more time indoors and therefore we have higher exposure to some of the indoor POPs that we know are found in dust and carpets and lounges and things like that, things like PFOS and the penta and the octa-BDEs. And also, I think the common one is the polar bear's longer period of starvation due to the ice melt has led to higher internal exposures to POPs stored in their fats. Now, I could talk about this forever, but I won't. I will go back to my subject, which is the POPRock. And number 10 slide, the question I'm so often asked is, well, why do we as NGOs, non-government organisations, participate in POPRock? Why don't we focus on getting things done in our own home country? And my response to that is if you're dealing with these sort of global chemicals, global bans and restrictions are incredibly time effective and resource efficient. If you spend 2 to 3 years getting a chemical banned in 170 countries, the amount of time and effort and resources it saves every individual NGO working within their own country to have that chemical banned, it's just incredibly efficient and effective way of dealing with things. There's other reasons as well. You know, we have full participation in the meetings and the working groups, which I've got to say is more than we do have in many of our own national regulatory schemes, for example, in my own. We have the access to a lot of technical information we may not have access to otherwise, but we also have the ability to provide a lot of technical information. And I think that input of community and Indigenous knowledge really makes the process so much more useful and I think really helps with a lot of the outcomes. And it also allows us to highlight issues as such as mixtures. Endocrine disruption is one that we have been really pushing the committee to think about. And this concept of trivial use, if I had mentioned that 10 years ago, I don't think people have any idea what we were talking about. But when we started to look at chemicals like PFOS and think about, is it really worth continuing to allow the use of a POPs chemical that never breaks down to ensure that your handbag is stain resistant? Well, I would call that a trivial use, and I would start to argue that no, it's not worth it, and we should really start to think about the sort of uses that are crucial and not trivial. And the other important reason why NGOs participate is because we need to counter the industry influence. The committee is very reliant on current producers of the candidate POPs for information on alternatives, their availability, the phase-out timelines, and so much of this is covered by confidential business information restrictions. It is very, very hard, and we do our best to help the committee find out more information from perhaps different industries. And I would also suggest that once the chemical is considered by the POPRock, it certainly is on its way out. And so I think all in all, it's very effective. So my last one before I move on to what happened in POPRock 10 is just to look at the current POPRock activities. So far, there's 3 recommendations ready for COP7, which happens in May next year. That's a recommendation for listing of polychlorinated naphthalenes, hexachlorobutadiene, and PCPs, which we will touch on, and then Pam will talk about in her presentation. In the actual process still going, we have Dikeafate. Again, I'll speak to that in a second. Deca-BDE, which is a flame retardant, and short-chain chlorinated paraffins. And these are a chemical that I think we've been working on now probably as long as POPRock has been going. I think they're 9 years in the system now, and they are stuck at that second stage of evaluation. And unfortunately, because they are still used, a lot of commercial considerations appear to be blocking the move of SCCPs to that third stage of evaluation, the risk management evaluation, even though socioeconomic factors are to be considered there, not in the second stage where it seems to be stuck. But we have heard that next year there will be a renewed push to get it through with a whole lot more information. And of course, we don't know what others are waiting to be announced. We are expecting an announcement from other countries with new chemicals as of our next COP. So we're all holding our breath to see what will come. So I'm not sure, Diane, if you'd like me to just continue on with what happened in POPRock, or you'd like me to take a break, or how you'd like. Otherwise, I'll just continue.
Well, my plan was just to continue, but we could take a question or two right now, just leading up to your second part. I would be fine with that. So why don't we do that? We'll just take one or two questions if there's anything that's come up for people on this first segment, and then we do want to leave enough time to hear about the meeting more and to hear from Pam. So if you want to ask a question, press *2 to unmute your line and announce your name and affiliation. And if there are no questions now, that is fine too. But let me just give it a moment, see if anybody has any questions that will help them understand the rest of our conversation. Okay, well, nobody's stepping up just yet, so I would say just continue right on with the part about the meeting in Rome.
Okay. All right. Well, we're up to slide number 12, what happened to POPRock. And that's just a quick summary, and I'll deal with each of those in a bit more depth. But basically, we got the recommendation that pentachlorophenol would be Annex A listed with the specific exemptions for production and use of utility poles and crossarms. There was a conclusion that DECA was a POP, and it moved to its final evaluation. Dikeafate passed the screening criteria and moved on to the risk profile, and the PFOS alternative guidance was prepared. It's only interim guidance, and there was a good recommendation for labelling of consumer products. So first off, what happened? DECA being declared a POP was a great relief to many of us, because at POPRock 9, there had been a strong resistance to this. Both Japan and the flame retardant industry, the photo of them is down there at the bottom on the right, they rejected the argument that DECA was bioaccumulating, but the POPRock, using the language of the treaty, which I think is very important, why a treaty and the way a convention is written is important. They used the language and basically said, considering all the evidence in a balanced manner, it concluded that DECA is likely to meet the criteria in bioaccumulation. And that was all because of the differences between bioconcentration factors and bioaccumulation factors. Because DECA accumulates mostly via the diet, it didn't fulfill the bioconcentration factor, which is all to do with bioaccumulation in fish through ambient accumulation rather than diet. But anyway, the data that was presented this time by our expert, Dr. Greg Toomey, who came from the University of Manitoba, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who is a prominent scientist on food web bioaccumulation of DECA. He brought a lot of evidence, and I think really having him there showed the importance of independent expertise, and it really took a lot of the arguments away from the industry. As you probably know, DECA is a flame retardant in a lot of electrical and electronic equipment, and that means that it's a very bad contaminant of e-waste, and of course produces brominated dioxins and furans when it's burnt, and unfortunately a lot of our e-waste ends up being burnt. And both bioaccumulation and debromination were very crucial issues in the debate. And again, the importance of independent expert, as well as Greg Toomey, Associate Professor of Environmental Chemistry from Duke University, Dr. Heather Stapleton, also came along and talked about the whole problem of debromination. And certainly her research showed that there were high detections of congeners not present in the DECA technical mixture that were being detected both in the environment and in living organisms. And really that significant amounts of these ones, hexa and nona BDEs, were being found in the environment and could be from the debromination of DECA. And so it was, I think, a relief for many people that DECA moved through and is now on its way to a risk management evaluation, the final stage. The next chemical was Dikeafate, and I'm on to slide 14 now. What happened? Orchid growers' chemical of choice, Dikeafate, fulfills the POPs criteria. Again, Dikeafate had a rocky history. At the last meeting at POPRock 9, it had been set aside because the Indian member had blocked consensus, arguing that it did not fulfill the Annex D criteria. The fact that the Indian government is the largest producer of Dikeafate in the world did leave an unfortunate taste in many people's mouths, as it did appear that they were more protective of their industry. They argued that Dikeafate wasn't even toxic, that there wasn't a problem with it. Dikeafate is an organochlorine pesticide, a very old one, and it is chemically related to DDT, which is used as an intermediate in its synthesis. And unfortunately, it's used as a miticide and a acaricide on a wide variety of fruit, vegetables, ornamentals, and field crops. And why I call it the orchid grower's chemical of choice, if you go on the internet, and you go to pretty much any of the orchid growers associations in any country, the chemical that they use as the miticide is known as keltane, and keltane is basically Dikeafate. And I know with my own growers here, when I talk to them about the fact that they are using a chemical that has fulfilled the POPs criteria, that is related to DDT, they are shocked because they've never, ever thought of it as a serious chemical. But anyway, this meeting, POPRock 10, the Indian member didn't attend, and the POPRock 10 simply agreed that Dikeafate met the criteria, and it has progressed to the risk profile stage, which was a bit of a relief. I'm on to now slide 15, and that's what happened at POPRock 10. And I'm not going to talk about PCP, the scientific or the technical data. I'm going to leave that to Pam, because if there's ever an expert on PCP, Pam is certainly the expert. What I wanted to just talk a little bit about was the debate and the discussions that happened, and what that actually meant and how it was perceived. As people probably know, PCP has been around since the 1930s. It's highly dioxin contaminated. It's utilised in a number of products. But there was a huge battle at POPRock 10, and one that I truly believe damaged the reputation of countries and to some extent individuals. Many of the developing countries and members present that I spoke with viewed the fight over PCP as one of big developed countries trying to push through their industry needs at the expense of all others. And it appeared to them as if Canada and US were simply advocating for their wood treatment industry. And that perception, unfortunately, I think was highlighted by the fact that an ex-US EPA representative, who in the past had attended the POPRock meetings representing the US, was now part of the timber treatment industry delegation arguing for this unlimited exemption. That was unfortunate. We all know about the revolving door syndrome, but it was an example of it where I really think it did harm to the reputation of many. The US delegation in the debate went as far as saying that PCP wasn't even a POP, despite the committee having agreed that it fulfilled the Annex D criteria and the Annex E risk profile. And while, Canada claimed that their country's use of PCP was a critical use, when the NGOs persisted about actually how much of this chemical was used, they admitted that it was only used for 15% of their pole treatment. And they were pushing for an exemption and an Annex B listing, which would mean that there would be no time limit to that exemption. They also claimed that banning PCP would have implications in regards to trade with the US, who stated they used the PCP on 38% of their treated utility poles. And I think you've got to remember this is arguments being made in front of developing countries who were saying, well, we can do without this chemical, so how come these big, wealthy, developed countries can't? And of course, all of this argument and debate ended up with then the Indian government saying, well, you know, we use PCP for wood treatment for particle boards, and we want an exemption for that use. But that was just simply quickly dismissed. And not that I particularly thought an exemption for that use was a good idea. There was that sense that, okay, one person's exemption was important, but another person's exemption wasn't. So it wasn't a good look for anybody. During the discussions, an impassioned intervention by the South African government observer, who the photo is of there, chiding the behaviour of developed countries and reminding everyone about the impacts of PCPs, meant that at the end of the meeting, Canada basically stood alone, because remember, the US is only an observer, and every other member of the committee advocated for an Annex A listing. And I don't know how the chair achieved it, but finally Canada agreed not to block consensus and agreed with a recommendation for Annex A, and that went forward. And I personally feel we should be deeply indebted to that Canadian delegate, because I can imagine that decision that she made is probably not going to be appreciated when she goes home. But all in all, I don't think the US came out looking good in that situation at all. Anyway, on to the next slide, which is 16. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about what's wrong with Annex B listing. And I give the PFOS story. People say, well, if it was listed in Annex B or Annex A, what would be the difference? Well, the difference is if it's listed in Annex B, any exemption in Annex B, there's acceptable uses and there's specific exemptions. The acceptable uses and specific exemptions under Annex B may not have any time limitations. So basically what you're saying is you can use this chemical forever. Now, that may be very appropriate for something like DDT, which is really, really critical for some countries in vector control in malaria. And I think that is a totally different situation than, for example, in the PFOS story, where we have a chemical which is incredibly toxic, incredibly bioaccumulative. It's an immunosuppression. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, so it contaminates our babies in utero. It's a ubiquitous residue right through humans and wildlife, and it is a terminal product with no further breakdown. So you have this incredibly horrible chemical, which is now listed in Annex B, and in a way that was a failing of the POPRock. The recommendation that went from POPRock 3 was to the COP was saying, well, you could list it in A or B. And I don't think they'll ever do that again, because when that got to the COP, countries started to go, well, maybe I should get an exemption for any use that I can think of. Most of the countries at the COP didn't have a clue whether their industry used it or not. But, you know, people were putting up their hands and saying, well, I've heard that it may be used in carpets, so I need an exemption for carpets. I heard it may be used in paper and packaging. I need an exemption in paper. And then I think the most striking one was when China said, well, we want it for chemically driven oil production. And when we tried to clarify what that actually meant, it meant in drilling and fracking fluids. And so because it was listed in Annex B, we ended up with POPs being used in fracking, which is just silly. The silliness continued, because then countries, once all these exemptions and acceptable purposes went through, countries were simply requesting all exemptions and all acceptable purposes, or acceptable uses, just in case their industry, and so maybe using it. And so we have examples now where Asian countries have listed their need for an acceptable purpose exemption to use PFOS on leaf-cutting ants, which don't even exist in the region. So really, POPRock now does try to avoid Annex B listing unless there is a real crucial critical use, like a public health use. So just continued what happened in POPRock 10. POPRock continued with their alternative guidance for the COP evaluation of these acceptable purposes, and specific exemptions. So they looked at over 50 alternatives based on their persistence and bioaccumulation. They certainly found that one of those alternatives, one of the siloxanes, D4, met all of the Annex D POP screening criteria. They found the chlorpyrifos might meet some of them. There were 34 alternatives that simply just could not be classified because there wasn't information. And this, remember, are alternatives that are already being used. 11 were commercial products, and so all we had was the name, nothing else, no data on its persistence or bioaccumulation or its toxicity, not even its scientific identity. And all of those commercial products were protected under confidential business information. They found that 18 of the alternatives being used for PFOS were unlikely to meet persistence and bioaccumulation criteria, and they also found that the information was extremely difficult to verify, mainly because of commercial business information. But on the positive side, another document where countries reported what they were doing, it was a Secretariat document, and they reported to the Secretariat about what they were using as alternatives. There was only one usage, which was photo imaging, where not one country said they had an alternative. All other uses, at least one or a few countries reported alternatives. And the other important thing that happened was that the POPRock recommended labelling of consumer products containing PFOS. Again, if you're going to have an exemption, there has to be some payment for that and labelling, because personally I don't want to ever have to buy a carpet knowing that it may or may not have PFOS stain resistance. So, nearly at the end, I'm just going to end on some challenges for POPRock. That's slide number 18. The sort of challenges we're facing, really, the POPRock faces, is assistance for developing countries in preparing nominations. It is quite challenging for countries, and we have smaller developing countries saying, well, they would like to nominate, but they're a bit overwhelmed by that process. And so how do we assist countries to prepare their nominations? Some of the other challenges to do with information, the access to independent research and expertise. The fact that we had independent experts come to POPRock 10 was really because Norway brought them there because it was one of their nominations that they were discussing. There are a lot of data gaps and lack of environmental monitoring and biomonitoring with both the chemicals that are being assessed, but also their alternatives. There's a total lack of independent information on alternative technical feasibility and availabilities and costs. And as I said earlier, it's very difficult in verifying much of this information. The POPRock still suffers from quite limited medical and human health input, but we do now have a new member who is a medical doctor, and that part of expertise to come onto the POPRock is very, very welcomed. We have limited scope of industry representation. While there is a lot of industry representation, they only represent certain areas of industry. And for example, this time the steel industry came and it really made a difference to the discussions around PCP. They had never come before, and it was important. And of course, there's very, very few resources for NGO participation. And so actually trying to find the resources to get even a small team of NGOs there, I think we had 5 this time. Well, when you compare that to some of the industry representations where, 15 industry reps will come for one industry association, we are really struggling. But for a very small team, I think it did a very, very good effort. And on that, I will end and say thank you very much for listening. That's a lovely photo of a sunset in Rome, so it's an appropriate time for me to end. So thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. And again, hold on to your questions. We will have a little bit of time at the end for those. And I'd like to go ahead and invite Pam to go ahead with her presentation.
Thank you, Diana. And I'd also like to thank Marianne, my learned colleague from Australia. I think it's really important to note the tremendously effective role that she's played in the POPRock process for over 10 years in the Stockholm Convention, and it's just been inspiring to work with Marianne and our small but mighty group from the International POPs Elimination Network. So I want to thank you, Marianne.
Thank you.
So this first slide just talks about, the title slide is really an entree to talk about why we are involved as a small organization here in Alaska Community Action on Toxics. And I think Marianne touched on some of this in that these persistent organic pollutants do not respect political boundaries. It's important that we work on this particular convention because it is an opportunity to address and prevent the production and release of so many chemicals that do affect the Arctic and that have global effects on health and the environment. And I'm going to talk about the pentachlorophenol as a case study as we move along here and why we fought so hard to ensure Annex A listing of pentachlorophenol. So we'll move on to the next slide, which simply shows, again, how these POPs arise on wind and ocean currents and are transported into the Arctic, where they bioaccumulate in the bodies of wildlife as well as people and have profound effects on ecosystem health and on the health of particularly indigenous peoples of the Arctic. Next slide, please. This slide highlights some of the language that we fought for in the negotiation of the Stockholm Convention, and I'll highlight the last one, really, that acknowledges in the preamble of the convention that Arctic ecosystems and indigenous communities are particularly at risk. And this is really because of the phenomenon of global transport of these chemicals, where the Arctic in the north and the Antarctic in the south are hemispheric sinks for these global contaminants that are transported via wind and ocean currents and that have nowhere to go once they reach the cold environment of the Arctic and the Antarctic. Next slide, please. Marianne talked a little bit about the process of listing of pentachlorophenol, or the recommendation that the POPRock made for the listing of pentachlorophenol. And it is used primarily now for wood treatment of utility poles in the U.S. and Canada. The use in Canada and the U.S. encompasses approximately 85% of the world use of pentachlorophenol. India has a small amount of use for particle board and paints, but the primary uses are here in North America, in the U.S. and Canada. Dow and Monsanto were the first to produce and introduce PCP in about 1936. There's currently only one manufacturer of this chemical for wood treatment, and that chemical company is located just south of the border in Mexico. It's a maquiladora type of facility, a very dirty facility that produces a lot of dioxins and furans in the production of pentachlorophenol. So it's manufactured south of the border, and then it's formulated in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, in a sister facility that KMG Chemicals has in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. It's been banned in over 26 countries, or at least 26 countries. So this really does show that there are viable and safer alternatives that have been put in place by most countries in the world. And this increasingly isolates, I think, the position of U.S. and Canada in opposing the listing of this chemical. It was proposed as a POPs candidate by the European Commission in 2011. And last year, during the Annex E discussion, the POPRock determined that as a result of the long-range transport, this chemical is likely to lead to significant adverse human health and environmental effects such that global action is warranted, which is why it moved on to the Annex F discussion, the development of a risk management evaluation, and ultimately at this last meeting of the POPs Review Committee, a recommendation to the Conference of Parties for listing in Annex A for global elimination. And you see the structure of this phenolic compound that is very resistant to degradation. We'll move on to the next slide. one of the things that I think is so important about our participation in this is that we bring a lot of scientific and medical evidence to the POPs Review Committee. So for us to prepare for this, we reviewed dozens and dozens of scientific studies and brought this information in the form of work in the intercessional period as well as interventions at the POPs Review Committee, presented these studies, the references, as well as the studies themselves. I think it's important to know, and this is one of the reasons why we fought so hard to get this chemical recommended for listing. It is detected throughout the global environment, in air, water, and soil. It's found in the bodies in all these different types of tissues of humans throughout the world, including indigenous peoples of the Arctic. It's one of the most dominant organic chemical contaminants within populations in Scandinavia, as well as the Chukotkin people. The Chukotkin people are just right across the border, very close to us in Alaska. Elevated concentrations are actually detected in people throughout the Arctic, and it's a dominant phenolic compound or contaminant in Inuit people from Nunavut in Arctic Canada. And researchers have found recently that pentachlorophenol now may be even more important than PCBs as a chemical of high concern for human health. Next slide, please. And I wanted to mention also that pentachlorophenol is a very powerful endocrine disrupting chemical, and it disrupts not only thyroid function, but it also has reproductive consequences in that is anti-estrogenic, anti-androgenic. It affects hormones in the brain that guide neurodevelopment, as well as reproduction, insulin formation, and really has many, many adverse effects, including an increased risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Some of the worst effects, though, have to do with neurodevelopmental effects in children. And many studies now have shown that prenatal exposure to this chemical affects learning and memory in children throughout their childhood if they're exposed prenatally. And in one of the scientific papers that I reviewed, a very rare occurrence was that the scientists actually concluded, and it's unusual in the sense that scientists don't often speak this way in scientific papers, unrelenting efforts should be made to find safe alternatives for these compounds. Just recently in September, the U.S. National Toxicology Program reclassified pentachlorophenol as reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen, which I think is a very significant finding, and one that the chemical industry tried to refute as nothing new, when in fact this was a very important reassessment of this chemical. Slide, please. I mentioned that the primary use in the U.S. and Canada for treatment of utility poles and cross arms, wooden utility poles. This use of pentachlorophenol is a very significant source of dioxins and furans that are produced through the manufacturing as byproducts of the manufacturing of pentachlorophenols. Dioxins and furans are also released during the use. So this shows a utility pole that was recently installed in Long Island, New York, and you can see the leaching of pentachlorophenol as well as dioxins and furans that contaminate the surrounding soils, air, as well as groundwater. And in this case study of Long Island, the levels of pentachlorophenol were 250,000 micrograms per kilogram. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of that, it's about 300 times the regulatory level that New York had established for cleanup of soils. So very high levels. These poles are installed in neighborhoods and around schools, and children are simply not protected from exposure. And the regulatory system that we have in place in the U.S. as well as Canada do not offer protections to children who play around these poles, who come in contact with these poles, the soils and the water around the poles. oftentimes the utility poles, once they've reached their end of life, are donated by the utilities to other uses. For example, 67% of the poles in a survey of 3,000 utilities in the U.S. were donated to schools for use in gardens and other public uses. And this is very simply wrong and a very important exposure route that results in additional POPs exposure to children as well as other people that come in close proximity to it. So this is a POPs contaminated waste. It's a hazardous waste. Each utility pole needs to be treated as hazardous waste, but right now they're simply donated for other public uses or disposed of in conventional landfills. So this is something that I think we need to address in years going forward. Slide, please. I think one of the reasons that the POPs Review Committee voted to recommend Annex A listing was that it's very clear that there are a number of safe, non-chemical alternatives that are both viable and readily available and economical. And you see them listed there. And these often require less maintenance and have a longer service life. So over the life of the poles are actually more economically viable and certainly more environmentally viable than using persistent organic pollutant to treat utility poles. Next slide, please. I'm just going to end with a couple of slides here again to highlight a point that Marianne made, and that is that our participation in this and the participation of Indigenous peoples, which ACAT has worked to foster, is really critical in reminding the delegates that these are not abstract issues, that we are fighting for health and human rights, to prevent exposures, to protect future generations. And I think that our organizations and the participation of groups such as ours, as well as International Indian Treaty Council and the Inuit Circumpolar Council, really we've become the conscience of this convention. And I think our role is actually quite critical. The next, and I believe last slide, is a demonstration that we had at the beginning of the Conference of Parties. And we were joined by, you can see Vaiwahi there, who is here in the room, as well as Andrea Carmen, Shauna Larson, International Indian Treaty Council, and other Indigenous participants, again, there to remind the delegates that this is a health and human rights issue. And these are just some of the resources that we'll also have listed in on our website. So I thank you and would welcome any questions.
So again, thank you, Pam, thank you, Marianne, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I think we'll go over about 5 minutes just so we can make sure that if there is a question out there that we can take that. So if you'd like to ask a question, please press *2 to unmute your line. State your name and affiliation, and we ask that you do try to be brief since so other people have the opportunity and since we are a little short on time. So again, *2 if you'd like to unmute your line and make a comment or ask a question of our speakers.
Hi, this is Judy Hatcher at Pesticide Action Network North America in Oakland.
Hi, Judy.
Hey. I am fairly new to the POPRock process, and I'm looking forward to being more of a participant and learning from Pam's experience in working with ACAT and IPEN and other folks in the space. I guess my question is, from my brief experience in other settings like this, is how infuriating it is to be a U.S. citizen, during these negotiations. And I understand that we are limited on the ground as discussions are happening, in Rome or Geneva. Do you have suggestions about ways that we can actually do a better job of getting our government's intentions before these meetings? to queue them up for these dialogues when they're on the site?
Yeah, hi Judy. Nice to hear from you. Well, as noted, the U.S. is not a party to the convention. The U.S. Senate has not ratified the convention, and yet the U.S. shows up as an observer. So they're really in the same role as we are as NGOs in the POPRock and at the Conference of Parties. I think as U.S. citizens, it's important that we are there to participate in the working groups of the POPs Review Committee, as well as testify and present interventions at the POPs Review Committee, as well as the Conference of Parties. We've also interacted with the EPA and the State Department in meetings prior to the POPs Review Committee and the Conference of Parties to let our views be known, to interact with them. We don't always influence their opinion. In fact, the EPA actually, I think, played a very detrimental role in opposing the listing of pentachlorophenol, but yet it moved forward, I think, in part because of the evidence that we presented to the full committee and because of our active participation in the working groups intersessionally. So I think we can be effective as U.S. citizens, as members of the global community, to bring scientific information, to bring information about health and human rights to the committee. I think that's the most effective role, and maybe Marianne can add some things as well.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about the activities in the intersessional working groups, they are just so important because really that's where the documents get written. And sometimes our efforts put there are more useful than our efforts put with our individual government delegations. Like at the moment, we're lucky in Australia, we have a reasonably good member of the POPRock who does listen, but I don't know if I would spend an awful lot of time with my government at the moment because they're not listening. So I think, we really need to think about how to put our resources to the best use and the most effective use. And at the moment, I think it is at that international stage. And for a while, we will have to go around our governments rather than try to, bring them kicking and screaming to the table. So, yeah, I think working at the meetings, but more importantly, working in those intersessional working groups is really where you can have the best influence.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I do believe we are out of time. You're welcome to email any additional questions to me, and I'll do my best to get them to our speakers for responses. Our next Che Alaska teleconference will be on Wednesday, December 10th at our normal 9 a.m. Alaska time. We'll be discussing health effects of perinatal exposures to BPA and other endocrine disrupting chemicals. And Dr. Nicole Acevedo, a postdoctoral researcher at Tufts University School of Medicine, will discuss how exposure to EDCs during windows of fetal development may have adverse health effects in adults. We'll also be joined by Kathy Curtis of Clean and Healthy New York, who will give us an update on state policies to protect public health. We hope you can join us for that call, and you can sign up on our website. Again, that's on December 10th. Also, just a reminder that a recording of today's call will be available on our website. And I just want to thank everyone again for calling in, and thank Marianne for joining us all the way from Australia. And Pam, thank you so much.